Some objects don't belong to the present. They belong to a story someone tried to bury. The words echoed in William Harrington's mind the moment he saw it, the silver locket resting gently against the chest of Emily Carter, as she moved between tables in the quiet glow of the upscale Manhattan restaurant. Everything about her was ordinary at first glance. Black apron, simple posture, careful steps, the kind of waitress most people would forget within minutes. But William didn't forget details. He built his empire on them. And that locket, it didn't belong in a place like this. "Miss," he called out sharply, not taking his eyes off it. Emily paused mid-step, tray balanced steadily in her hand. "Yes, sir," she replied calmly, the kind of calm that didn't bend under pressure. William leaned back slightly, studying her like a problem he hadn't expected to solve tonight. "I'll make this simple," he said, sliding a sleek black card onto the table without breaking eye contact. $1 million. That locket. Right now. The nearby conversations faded just a little, subtle enough that only those paying attention would notice the shift. Emily glanced at the card, then back at him, expression unchanged. "It's not for sale," she said. No hesitation. No calculation. Just refusal. William exhaled through his nose, almost amused. "Everything is for sale. You just haven't heard the right number yet." That's when she stopped. Not because of him, but because something across the room changed. A man near the window had gone still, staring at the locket with a look of recognition that didn't belong in a casual dinner setting. That symbol," he whispered, just loud enough for William to catch it. "That's the Harrington crest." The name hit the air like a dropped glass. William's posture tightened instantly. His gaze snapped back to the locket, suddenly sharper, deeper, as if seeing it for the first time instead of the 100 assumptions he had already made. His voice lowered. "Where did you get that?" For the first time since he sat down, Emily's fingers tightened around it. Not defensively. Instinctively. Like muscle memory tied to something older than words. "From my mother," she said quietly. A pause. The kind that stretches just a second too long. "Before she passed away." The noise of the restaurant didn't return. It felt like the entire room had leaned in without moving. William stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the marble floor, drawing every eye in the room. But he didn't notice them. He only saw her. "That's not possible," he said, barely above a breath, like the truth had physically failed to fit inside his world. Emily took a small step back, confusion flickering for the first time. And in that moment William Harrington, the man who had bought companies, rewritten industries, and controlled outcomes before they happened, realized the one thing he could never purchase was the answer forming right in front of him. The silence in the restaurant did not break immediately after William Harrington stood up. It lingered, heavy and unnatural, as if the air itself was waiting for something to make sense again. Emily Carter remained still, her hand still resting over the silver locket as if letting go of it would change something irreversible. William did not move his eyes away from it. He had seen billions of dollars flow through negotiations without hesitation, had closed deals that reshaped entire industries, yet none of that compared to the strange pressure forming in his chest at this moment. "Say that again," he said quietly, his voice no longer sharp, but controlled in a way that meant something had shifted. Emily hesitated, then repeated softly, "It came from my mother. She gave it to me before she passed away." The words should have been simple. They were not. Because William was no longer listening to just words. He was listening to patterns, timelines, possibilities that refused to stay neatly separated. A man at a nearby table slowly set down his glass, his attention fully drawn in now, as if the atmosphere itself had turned into something fragile. William finally sat back down, but only halfway, as if his body could not decide whether to stay or leave. "Your mother," he repeated, testing the phrase like it belonged to a forgotten language. "What was her name?" Emily blinked, surprised by the question more than the offer of money earlier. "Claire," she said after a moment. William's expression changed just slightly at first. A tightening around the eyes. Pause that lasted too long. Then something deeper like recognition refusing to stay buried. "Claire Harrington?" he asked, almost against his own judgment. Emily frowned. "I do not know her last name. I was told she was just Claire." The air in the room seemed to thin. William reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out his phone, but stopped before unlocking it. Instead, he stared at Emily again, as if comparing her face to something only he could see. That locket, he said carefully, was believed to have been lost more than 20 years ago. Emily's grip tightened again, confusion rising now. Lost? She echoed. William nodded once slowly, as if each word cost more than the last. It belonged to my family. My mother used to describe it. She said it was given to someone she trusted more than anyone in the world. Emily's breath caught, subtle but visible. The room was still listening, but no one dared interrupt anymore. William continued, voice lower now, almost distant. After she passed away, it disappeared. No records. No trace. Just gone. He looked at the locket again, then back at her. Until now. Emily took a small step backward without realizing it, her mind visibly trying to catch up with something too large to process at once. You are saying this belonged to your family? She asked slowly. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her face with a focus that no longer belonged to business or curiosity, but to something far more personal. Finally, he said, I am saying that if what I am beginning to suspect is true, then you may not have been told the full story of who your mother really was. The words landed quietly, but they changed everything in the room. Emily stood frozen, the locket suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. And William Harrington, for the first time in his life, looked like a man standing at the edge of a truth that could not be negotiated, only uncovered. William Harrington did not move for several seconds after speaking. The weight of what he had just implied seemed to settle deeper into the space between him and Emily Carter, as if the restaurant itself had grown quieter just to hold the moment. Emily stood still, her hand still wrapped around the silver locket, her breathing shallow but controlled, trying to anchor herself to something familiar while everything else began to feel uncertain. William finally exhaled slowly, then leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if the truth required protection rather than announcement. There is something you need to understand, he said. My family does not lose objects like that by accident. That locket was part of a private chain, passed through only a few people. It was last seen more than 20 years ago, and after that, it simply disappeared without explanation. Emily's eyes tightened slightly, not in anger, but in confusion layered with something she could not yet name. I do not understand why this matters so much to you, she said quietly. William studied her face again, more carefully now, as if trying to find alignment between memory and reality. Because, he replied, it belonged to my mother's closest friend, a woman she trusted with things she trusted no one else with. The words seemed to land differently this time. Emily looked down at the locket, her thumb tracing its worn edge instinctively. For years it had been nothing more than a quiet presence in her life, a reminder of a woman she barely remembered, a woman who raised her in fragments of stories and short-lived moments. But now, under William's gaze, it felt heavier, like it was carrying something she had never been told. William reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a folded photograph. He hesitated for only a second before placing it on the table between them. Emily did not touch it at first. She only looked. The image showed a younger version of the locket, worn by a woman standing beside a much younger version of William's mother. Emily's breath caught, subtle but undeniable. The resemblance to the locket she held was exact. This woman, William said quietly, pointing at the second figure, was someone my family believed disappeared from our lives completely. No forwarding address, no records, nothing. Emily slowly lowered herself into the chair across from him without realizing she had moved. Her voice when it came was softer than before. My mother never told me anything about her past, she said. Only that I should keep this safe. That it mattered more than I would understand. William nodded slightly, as if that confirmed something he had been afraid to believe. Then we are both missing the same part of the story, he said. For the first time since this began, silence between them did not feel like tension. It felt like gravity pulling two incomplete truths toward the same center. Emily finally looked up at him directly. What are you suggesting? She asked. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the locket again, then back at her. His expression no longer that of a man trying to buy something, but of someone standing in front of a locked door he had spent his entire life unknowingly circling. "I am suggesting," he said slowly, "that your mother and my family were connected in ways that were never meant to be forgotten, and that someone made sure we would never ask the right questions until now." The air between them tightened again, not with fear, but with the realization that the truth they were approaching was no longer distant. It was already here, just waiting to be fully seen. The photograph remained on the table long after neither of them touched it again, as if both Emily Carter and William Harrington were afraid that even the slightest movement might collapse the fragile connection forming between past and present. The restaurant around them continued to exist, but it no longer felt like part of their world. William finally broke the silence, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority he usually carried without effort. "I need confirmation," he said, not as a demand, but as something closer to necessity. Emily looked at him carefully, her expression still uncertain, still trying to understand why a simple object had suddenly turned her life into something unfamiliar. "Confirmation of what?" she asked. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his phone again, this time unlocking it fully. His fingers paused for a brief moment above the screen before he spoke. "If what I suspect is even partially true, then this is not something I can leave unresolved." He stood slowly, stepping slightly away from the table, lowering his voice as he made a call. Emily could not hear the entire conversation, only fragments, enough to understand it was not casual. Words like records, archive, and verification passed through the air in controlled tones. She remained seated, watching him, feeling an unfamiliar pressure build in her chest, as if the ground beneath her understanding was no longer stable. When William returned, he did not sit immediately. Instead, he placed his phone on the table between them, screen facing down, as if even looking at it directly carried weight. "I have someone checking historical family records," he said. "Old legal documents, archived registrations, anything that might connect your mother to my family's history." Emily frowned slightly, her voice soft but firm. "My mother was not a part of your world. I would have known if she was." William's expression did not change, but something in his eyes suggested he was no longer fully convinced of anything he once believed. "That is exactly what concerns me," he replied. A server approached briefly, sensing tension, asking if either of them needed anything, but William declined without looking away from Emily. The interruption felt almost unreal, like a reminder that time was still moving outside their conversation. When the server left, Emily finally spoke again. "Why now?" she asked. "If this connection existed for so long, why is it coming up only now?" William exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly in his chair. "Because that locket was believed to have been lost permanently," he said. "And because I was told very clearly that asking about it again would lead nowhere." Emily studied him, processing the implication behind those words. "Told by who?" she asked. William hesitated for the first time since this began, just long enough for Emily to notice. "By the people who managed my family's estate after my mother passed away," he said finally. "They insisted it was a closed matter. No records, no history, no remaining ties." Emily looked down at the locket again, her fingers tightening slightly as if it had become the only stable object left in a shifting reality. "But if that is true," she said slowly, "then why does it feel like there is still something missing?" William did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her with a focus that was no longer analytical, but deeply personal, as if he was beginning to see her not as a stranger holding a mysterious object, but as the final piece of a question he had never known how to ask. "Because," he said quietly, "some truths do not disappear. They are only delayed." And as those words settled between them, the phone on the table lit up with an incoming message that neither of them had yet read, but both already knew would change everything again. The notification on the phone remained unread for a moment, glowing softly on the dark table between Emily Carter and William Harrington, as if neither of them was ready to acknowledge that the past was once again forcing its way into the present. William stared at it first, his expression tightening slightly before he finally picked up the device. Emily did not move, but her eyes followed every motion. William unlocked the screen, and the brief silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said so far. He read once, then again. His face changed, not dramatically, but in a way that made it clear something fundamental had just shifted. "They found something," he said quietly. Emily's voice came almost immediately, softer than before. "What kind of something?" William hesitated, as if choosing how much truth could safely exist in a single sentence. "A partial record," he said. "From a private hospital archive. It references your mother under a different surname. One that was connected to my family trust decades ago." Emily's grip on the locket tightened instantly, her breath catching for a fraction of a second before she steadied herself. "That cannot be right," she said, more to herself than to him. William looked up from the phone, his eyes now carrying something closer to certainty than speculation. "It is not a coincidence anymore," he replied. "Too many connections. Too many points that align too precisely." Emily leaned back slightly, trying to process the weight of what he was saying. Her entire life had been built around a simple understanding of her past. A single name. A single object. A single memory. Now that foundation felt like it was beginning to fracture. William continued, his voice lower but more focused. "The record indicates that your mother was admitted under emergency circumstances years ago. There was a confidentiality directive attached to her file. Not standard. Highly restricted. Only a handful of people would have had access." Emily looked up sharply. "Why would my mother need something like that?" William shook his head slowly. "That is exactly what I am trying to understand." A long pause followed. The kind that did not feel empty, but full of everything neither of them had the answers to yet. Then William added, "There is something else. The name attached to that directive matches someone who was directly involved in managing my family's affairs at the time the locket disappeared." Emily felt a cold stillness settle in her chest. "So you are saying," she said carefully, "that my mother and your family were not just connected but deliberately separated?" William did not answer immediately, and that silence was more revealing than words. Finally he said, "I am saying someone had a reason to make sure neither side could trace the other." Emily looked down at the locket again, but this time it did not feel like an object of memory. It felt like evidence. William leaned forward slightly, his voice now measured, controlled, but no longer distant. "Emily, I need you to understand something very clearly," he said. "If this is what I believe it is becoming, then your life was not just private. It was protected from something." Emily met his gaze, uncertainty and tension blending in her expression. "Protected from what?" she asked. William paused, then answered quietly, "From the truth that someone did not want either of us to find." The words settled between them like a final lock clicking into place, and for the first time since the conversation began, neither of them reached for answers, because both of them now understood that the next truth would not simply explain the past. It would redefine everything they thought they knew. The moment William Harrington finished speaking, the weight of his words did not fade. It expanded, filling the space between him and Emily Carter like something neither of them could escape. Emily sat still, her fingers still locked around the silver locket, but her gaze had shifted downward, no longer focused on William but on the impossible idea forming in her mind. Something had been hidden. Not lost. Not forgotten. Hidden. William watched her closely, his expression no longer purely analytical. There was something else there now, something more grounded and uncertain at the same time. He had spent his entire life dealing with certainty. Numbers. Contracts. Verifiable outcomes. But nothing about this situation behaved like anything he understood. Emily finally spoke, her voice quiet, controlled but strained at the edges. "If what you are saying is true," she said slowly, "then my entire life was built on something incomplete." William did not respond immediately. He seemed to choose his words with unusual care. "Not incomplete," he said finally. "Redirected." That word lingered in the air longer than expected. Emily looked up at him. Why would anyone redirect a person's entire identity? William's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in thought. "That is the question I have been trying to answer since I saw that locket," he said. A brief silence followed. Then William leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "There is another detail the records mentioned. Something that was flagged but never explained." Emily's attention sharpened instantly. "What detail?" William hesitated just long enough to signal its importance. Your mother was not alone when she entered the system under that name. There was another file attached. One that was sealed under a different classification entirely. Emily felt a subtle shift in her breathing. A second file for who? William met her eyes directly. For someone connected to my family. Someone who had legal authority over certain private assets at the time. Emily frowned, confusion mixing with growing unease. What does that have to do with me? William exhaled slowly. Because that authority was revoked shortly after your mother disappeared from all records. Emily stared at him, her mind trying to organize fragments that refused to align. You are saying my mother was removed from something, she said carefully. At the same time someone in your family lost control of something else? William nodded once. That is what the timeline suggests. The restaurant around them continued to exist, but it felt increasingly distant, as if the world outside their conversation had become irrelevant. Emily finally stood slightly from her chair, not fully, but enough to feel the need for movement. This does not feel like coincidence anymore, she said. William agreed quietly. It is not. Another pause followed, deeper this time. As both of them understood, they were no longer dealing with a simple missing connection. They were dealing with intentional absence. Emily looked at the locket again, then whispered almost to herself, if someone went to this much effort to separate my mother from your family, then what were they afraid would happen if we ever found each other? William did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, almost careful. That, he said, is what I intend to find out before someone else decides we are not supposed to. And for the first time since this began, Emily realized the truth they were approaching was not just about the past. It was about why the past had been buried in the first place. For several seconds after William Harrington spoke, neither he nor Emily Carter moved, as if even the smallest action could fracture the fragile truth forming between them. The restaurant had faded into a distant blur of sound and motion, reduced to nothing more than background noise against the gravity of their conversation. Emily remained standing now, her hand still holding the silver locket, but her grip had loosened slightly, as if her body was beginning to accept that this object carried more than memory. William watched her carefully, his expression no longer purely analytical, but marked with something closer to concern. He had come into this evening expecting clarity, but instead he was standing at the edge of something far more complicated than business, far more personal than any negotiation he had ever led. Emily finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. If what you believe is true, she said, then someone did not just hide information. They removed an entire connection between two lives. William nodded slowly. That is exactly what it feels like, he replied. A pause followed, longer than the others, as both of them seemed to understand that the shape of the truth was beginning to form, even if its edges were still hidden. William then reached for his phone again, his movements slower now, less certain. There is one more thing I need to verify, he said. Emily looked up immediately. What now? William hesitated, then opened the device and turned it slightly so she could see the screen. It displayed a brief summary of archived notes and restricted annotations. This, he said quietly, is a reference to a transfer of guardianship rights that occurred shortly after your mother's disappearance from official records. Emily's breath caught faintly. Guardianship, she repeated. William nodded. It suggests that after your mother was removed from documented systems, someone else was assigned responsibility for you, or for your identity at the time. Emily stepped back slightly, her expression tightening with confusion and disbelief. I was never told anything like that, she said. William's voice remained calm, but there was a new urgency beneath it. That is because it was never meant to be part of your known history, he replied. Emily looked down at the locket again, and for the first time it no longer felt like a personal keepsake. It felt like a key that had been deliberately hidden from a door she did not know existed. Who would have control over something like that? She asked. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the distant end of the restaurant, as if measuring distance, consequence, and risk all at once. When he finally spoke, his tone was lower than before. Someone with legal authority over both your past and my family's private structure at the time, he said. Emily frowned slightly. That is too vague, she replied. William met her gaze directly. It has to be vague, he said. Because if it is specific, then it means this was not random. It was directed. The words settled heavily between them. Emily slowly lowered herself back into the chair, as if her strength had shifted from standing to thinking. William remained standing for a moment longer, then finally sat again, but this time there was no comfort in the movement. We are not dealing with absence anymore, he said quietly. We are dealing with control. Emily looked at him, her voice softer now. Control over what? William glanced at the locket one more time before answering. Control over whether we were ever supposed to know each other's existence at all. And in that moment, as the last piece of that realization began to settle into place, both of them understood that the next discovery would not simply explain the past, it would reveal the reason it had been hidden so carefully from the very beginning. The weight of William Harrington's last words seemed to settle deeper into the space between him and Emily Carter, as if the restaurant itself had become a silent witness to something neither of them fully understood yet. Emily sat motionless for a moment, her eyes fixed on the silver locket resting against her palm, no longer seeing it as a simple object but as something that had carried an unseen history across years she had never been told about. William remained seated across from her, his posture less controlled now, more human, as if the structure he usually relied on had begun to fracture under the pressure of what they were uncovering together. Emily finally spoke, her voice softer than before, almost uncertain. If someone had that much control, she said slowly, then how do we even begin to find out who they were? William did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the phone on the table, then back at her, as if weighing the cost of continuing versus turning away. We begin with what cannot be erased, he said quietly. Digital records, financial traces, and people who were close enough to see what happened, even if they were never meant to speak about it. Emily frowned slightly. And you believe those people still exist? William nodded once. People do not disappear from systems like this without leaving echoes behind. The question is whether those echoes were ignored or intentionally buried. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the distant sounds of the restaurant continuing its normal rhythm, unaware of how completely the world at this table had shifted. Emily looked down again at the locket, her thumb tracing its surface in a slow, unconscious motion. My entire life, she said quietly. I believe this was just something my mother left me. A memory, nothing more. William's expression softened slightly, though his focus remained sharp. It may still be a memory, he said, but it is no longer only that. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. There is something else I need to tell you. Emily looked up immediately, tension returning to her posture. What else could there possibly be? William hesitated for a brief moment, then spoke. The name attached to the restricted guardianship record is not unknown. It appears repeatedly in legal structures tied to my family's legacy. Not publicly, privately, always behind layers of confidentiality. Emily felt a slight tightening in her chest. So this person is still active? She asked. William's answer came carefully. Not officially. But influence does not always require visibility. Emily slowly leaned back, processing the implication. You are saying someone still has power over what happened decades ago, she said. William nodded. And possibly over why it was never allowed to surface. The realization hung between them like a final weight settling into place. Emily's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Then finding answers is not just about the past, she said. William met her gaze directly. No, he replied quietly. It is about whether the past was ever meant to remain hidden at all. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then William stood slowly, not abruptly this time, but with intention. There is someone I need to contact, he said. Emily looked up at him. Now. William nodded once. If this is what I think it is becoming, waiting is no longer an option. Emily stood as well, still holding the locket tightly, as if it had become the only stable link between her and everything unraveling around her. And as William turned slightly toward the exit of the restaurant, both of them understood that whatever truth they were approaching was no longer something they could observe from a distance, because it was already beginning to move toward them. William Harrington stopped just before reaching the exit of the restaurant, his phone already in hand, his expression focused in a way that Emily Carter had not seen since this entire night began. Emily followed a few steps behind him, still holding the silver locket, feeling as if the object had become heavier with every truth uncovered. The soft lighting of the restaurant now felt distant, almost irrelevant, as if the world outside their conversation no longer had any claim on either of them. William placed a call, speaking in a controlled, quiet tone, giving only essential details, names, and references to restricted archives. Emily could only hear fragments, but each one reinforced the feeling that something irreversible was already in motion. When the call ended, William turned back to her slowly. "I have confirmation," he said. Emily did not speak immediately. She simply waited, her entire posture still, as if even breathing might disrupt the moment. William continued, his voice lower now. The records were not only accurate, they were cross-verified with private legal documentation that had been sealed for over 2 decades. Emily felt a subtle tightening in her chest. "And what does that mean?" she asked quietly. William hesitated, and for the first time, his expression showed something closer to emotional restraint than intellectual control. "It means," he said slowly, "that your mother was not who I thought she was. And more importantly, neither were you." Emily frowned, confusion returning. "I do not understand." William looked at her directly. "Your mother's full legal identity before the records were altered connects her directly to my family line." The words did not immediately register. Emily blinked once, then again, as if trying to force meaning into something that refused to align with everything she had believed. "That is not possible," she said. William shook his head slightly. "It is not only possible. It is documented." A heavy silence followed. The restaurant around them continued its quiet rhythm, but everything between them had changed. Emily slowly lowered herself back into the chair, her grip on the locket loosening slightly, as if her body could no longer decide what to hold on to. "Then why was I never told?" she asked. William's voice softened but remained firm. "Because someone made sure you were never supposed to know who you were connected to." Emily looked down at the locket again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who am I connected to?" William paused for a long moment, then finally said, "To the Harrington legacy in a way that was deliberately erased from public record." Emily's breath caught, but she said nothing. William continued, "Your mother was removed from that history, and you were raised outside of it entirely. But the structure of the records, the timing, and the guardianship transfer all point to one conclusion." He stopped briefly, as if confirming that what he was about to say could not be taken back. "You are not outside that family line. You are part of it." The words settled into the space between them like something too large to fully comprehend at once. Emily stared at him, her voice unsteady for the first time. "Part of your family," she repeated slowly. William nodded once. "Yes." A long silence followed, deeper than any before it, because this was no longer about missing documents or hidden history. It was about identity itself. Emily's fingers tightened around the locket again, but this time not as a question, but as confirmation that something in her life had always been waiting for this exact moment. William looked at her carefully, his voice quieter now. "And if this is true," he said, "then whoever buried this truth did not just erase a record. They erased an heir." Emily did not respond immediately. She only looked at him, and for the first time, both of them understood that the truth they had uncovered was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something far larger than either of them had anticipated.